Hello, and thank you for joining us here on NCI Live. My name is David Groth. I'm your host, and I'm a technical sales specialist here at Network Center. Today, we're going to be talking about data governance and all its implications and what it is and so on. Joining me today is Todd Bortke. He is the VP of Operations here at Network Center. He's got 30 years of experience in healthcare, technology, software development, networking, security, operations, a lot of experience in the IT industry, also experience in healthcare industry, and that one has a lot of regulations specifically when it comes to data governance. Todd, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, David. Excited to have a conversation this morning.
I'm looking forward to it. This has been a really hot topic lately. I want to remind all of our viewers that we are both live on both LinkedIn and YouTube, so please feel free to chat us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them live. And if you need any feedback, obviously get a hold of us. So, Todd, let's talk. Can you give us a quick, and I know this data governance is not a thing you can give us quick on, but can you give us a very high level, what is data governance? Can you define it?
Yeah, sure, David. Like you said, it's a really big subject, right? But to kind of narrow it down, data governance is really the process of identifying data that exists, identifying where the data exists. In today's world, with as much data is being collected by companies today, it's very challenging, right? Because there's massive amounts of data. There's a lot of sources that are creating the data. And again, if you establish a data governance culture, and we'll talk more about that because it is a culture, but if we create that data governance culture, it'll really help us manage risk, particularly in the environment we are today. Really should help us maximize the value of that data, and it should really help overall reduce the cost for an organization by leveraging that data to make business decisions. And so it is a framework, but it really is about that.
Sure, certainly. And that makes complete sense. I've always been able to try to give people a summary of it and explain to them that it's, what is my data? It's the process and the framework, but also to give them an explanation of what is my data? Where is my data? Is my data even good? Can I get access to it? Because these days, the creation of data and management of data it becomes a task and a piece in and of itself, right? It becomes almost an unwieldy animal. Being able to do that. So what would you say that the value, I just mentioned a few things, but what would you say the value of a data governance piece is to any company?
Yeah, so data in itself has value, right? But it becomes valuable when you drive actions for your business off of that. And so the value of data governance is really around understanding the posture of your data, understanding, as you said, where it's at. The value comes in making sure that you have like a single source of truth for that data. And the value there becomes that you're not making business decisions maybe on two sets of data that aren't lining up identical. So the value of data governance is really that, as I said, it becomes a culture. It becomes how you handle data growth, how you handle potentially data destruction. And the value there really becomes managing that risk. And so it is not, the value becomes that it's organization wide. It's not specific to a certain department. So value can have a lot of considerations, but actionable data, and if you're using your data, that's the value. If you're just holding the data and storing it for legacy purposes, the value may be different. It may be because there's a regulatory value to it as compared to an actionable value to it.
So this isn't really, and that was going to be one of my questions. This isn't specifically an IT related thing. This is, as you mentioned, it's company wide and a cultural type thing. Like everybody has to be concerned with, okay, this is my data, but I want to make sure that this is the only data, like you said, prime source or a source of truth, right? This is the one piece of data. If you take any datum, I believe is the singular. You want to make sure that that is the true one. Then there's not 27 versions of that one. And so the framework right around that says, okay, we have a policy in place to make sure we only have one source of truth. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely correct in that. Is there's business decisions that have been made when the data has been modified, or there's two sets of data that aren't matching up identical, right? And so, real life example, you'll get in front of a leadership group or in front of a board or in front of a very strategic business decision. And all of a sudden, you'll have two mindsets looking at two different sets of data. And all of a sudden now it goes, well, can we trust our data? And that's a tremendous hurdle to get over for any company. So by having a data governance, and it is not just an IT project, as you said. Now, IT plays a big role in it, but when we think about it, you might have somebody like a chief data officer or somebody that's in charge, or a CIO that's in charge of your information, right? But you have people that are data owners. You have people that create data. And when you're creating data, you've got to think about integrity and all of that. And so when you step back, it's corporate wide, right? It's from a policy perspective. It's from an actual threat protection perspective, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big one. Yep.
Yeah. And then in the IT specific, you have things about backup and recovery, and then you have like data loss. And so it is corporate wide. There's training, there's educating staff, right? And so it is not an IT only project, and it's not a project. Let me rephrase that. It's not a project that starts and ends, but as you mentioned, it's a culture. It's starting a framework. It's ongoing forever. And if you stay in front of it, it becomes much more manageable and not such a daunting task.
Right, because new data is generated every minute, every day, and it can become, as I said, unwieldy, right? If things are just generated left, right, and it's all over the place. And you mentioned a point there about security and exposure and whatnot. Is a part of this then not only making sure the data is good data and back and forth, but also who has access to that data, right? Am I right?
Oh,
Is it sensitive data? Is
Yeah.
that another part of this?
Absolutely. And so part of the knowing where your data is, as we mentioned earlier, and that's really important, right? Because it exists in multiple locations, and we can probably touch on that in a little bit. But ease of access, or actually restricted access, because there's data that you're going to want both, right? For some people, they need to have ease to get to the data. For others, it needs to be very restrictive in getting there. And then when you know where your data is at, and we'll talk about probably data categorization. And when you talk about the types of data, sensitive versus maybe not as sensitive, or regulated data versus not regulated data, you need to know that you're securing that and that you're monitoring all of those locations where that data can be at. Because data can be somewhere temporary, it can be somewhere from a long-term archive, right? And you need to have some security threat protection wherever the data is. If it's sitting somewhere, if it's moving somewhere, if it's being currently used.
Right. You've got, I mean, and these days that isn't just in, you and I are of this, we've been in the business long enough where we can say that there was a time where in any company, data resided on a server, a couple of servers, you had file servers, right? And that was it. That's all you had. You had an F drive, a G drive. People would save their files there, and that was about it. That's all you had. Over time, it's been developed, right? And it's developed so now company data can be stored almost anywhere. I mean, it could be on, you still have file servers, but now we have cloud shares, cloud data. And I'm going to use Microsoft parlance, but we have OneDrive, SharePoint, we have, Amazon S3 buckets, we have what's Google Drive. All these different cloud, and I'm specifically talking about files now, but it could also just be databases. All this company data it's all encompassing, and it's huge. You talk about the data lake, right? We've heard those terms thrown about, and it's huge. So being able to get our arms around this is an entire topic all on its own.
And that's one of the primary starting points, right? As we just mentioned, as far as identifying what data you have, and then where is it? And as you said, I mean, there's everything in the cloud, right? There's a whole lot of data that could be on mobile devices, right? It could be on a work device. Some companies have policies that let data sit on a personal device for a short period of time. How are you managing that? And again, if we look back a few years, let's just look forward a few years. So the sooner we get a governance program in place, and as soon as the organization has complete buy-in to this, we're going to be able to manage the future locations of data much quicker and much more eloquently than we have in the past, right? So we've got to start by looking currently and looking back, but we really have to be ready to look for the future too, of where the data could reside or will reside.
So for this, right, who would make the plan, the decisions, and come up with these policies, procedures, and everything to put data governance in place?
I think it kind of depends on really the size of the organization, but typically what we see from a best practice or an implementation plan is first to have an executive team understand what data governance is, right? And get a buy-in that, yes, this is something organizationally we need to commit to. So there's that education and commitment piece to start with. And that can start from an IT leader, could start from a CIO, it could start from a chief security officer, it could start from a compliance officer, right? And so anybody at that, you got to have a champion. You get it to an executive level, to an understanding of what the data governance project, what the actual culture is going to need to look like. And once they agree that, yes, that makes sense, then it's stepping back and really finding out from your subject matter experts, right? So back to data owners, back to data users, and you start, let's identify at 30,000 feet the type of data we have and where it sits. And if we're going to do that, let's categorize it. So let's think about, okay, is this a piece of data that has a regulatory component to it? The world I came from and have spent so long in healthcare, right? PHI data. If you're in the financial institution, you've got the PII information over there, right? And then let's say that you have normal data. So you might end up with 3 classifications or 12 classifications of data. Some of that data might be patent-based data. You're going to protect that maybe even more securely than another piece of data. So categorizing your data and talking to the data owners and the data users and coming up with that 30,000 foot and then driving, deeper and deeper.
Is it a fair statement to say that those classifications are not just categories of types, but also security, and they could fall into different categories in multiple facets. Is that a fair statement?
It is, and this is probably an area where some companies will want to get very, very detailed in the classification of data, particularly if you own other companies. So if you're a holding company and you own other assets, you might have more categories than if you're a single standalone vertical company, right? But yes, and there's not a quick checklist to go out there, right? I mean, when you start the categorization, I think at least in my mind and others, as you and I talk and others, is there a regulatory component? Is there is there a legal component to it, right? Is there an actionable component to it? Is this information that's very proprietary to my business, meaning that if it got in the wild, that I could actually lose my business, right? And so it's those types of classifications, and then you can get very granular that this is payroll information if you wanted to, or this is software development information, right? So you can get very specific with it, but categorization is going to take a little bit of time to build out, and you're always potentially going to be changing and modifying. But visually, this is something that can really help if you create a visualization table of the type of data and what category it's in, and then put where it exists.
Right.
Now, visually, you can start to see that.
Right. It's like basically the map of where things are at. I'm going to stop here for 1 second during our conversation. Just remind people that are watching us, please, if you have those questions, go ahead and send them on in, so we can answer these questions. This particular topic, it's one that people don't ever think about, especially in the small to medium business, right? Large enterprise corporations, you've got your Coca-Colas, your Fords, those kinds of companies. They're constantly concerned about properties of that nature. But small to medium enterprisers going, I don't need to worry about that, do I? I would say that the answer is a absolute 100% yes, they do. Um, the conversations I have with the SMB folks have been, um, where's your data? Do you know where your data is? And more on that low level, just those basic questions. Where's your data? Who has access? Are you sharing it outside the company? Did anybody leave your company? And when they did they take your data with it? Do you know? Do you know? Would you say that that's also a fair statement, that it applies equally to SMB as well as enterprise?
It does, right? And this process scales, right? It scales from small, medium to large to very, very large. And it can seem like it's a daunting task, right? But it's not. Again, if you, for those of you joining in listening today, just think about maybe the data you touched this morning, or think about the data you're going to touch this afternoon or tomorrow. And what if you couldn't get to that data? I mean, does that mean your business still gets to operate? Does it mean that you go back to a manual process? Does it mean that you lose potential business, right? And so those things about just thinking about, if the power's out, the lights are off, and you can't get to data, right? What do you do? And so again, that data loss that you talked about, David, is so important, right? And when we wrap up today, we'll kind of talk about maybe what are the next 2 or 3 items that somebody should consider doing, and we're going to touch on those items there. But you're absolutely right. This is not just an enterprise project or an enterprise culture. It's really just a culture in the smaller companies. And here's one of the challenges with the smaller or more medium-sized companies. Typically, people wear many hats.
Yeah.
So when we talk about access to data, sometimes in smaller companies, a majority of the company might have access to what I'll say more restrictive or risky type of data. As in a larger company, it may be very well secured and controlled to a smaller environment. So there's as much risk, if not more, on the SMB side from a data governance in my mind.
And even though the process, correct me if I'm wrong, but even though the process might be simpler because you've got a smaller company and less in theory, less overall data to deal with. Yeah, the risk could be more because it's maybe not top of mind, right?
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
what other, and
Absolutely.
you mentioned challenges. What other challenges do you see in implementing data governance for an organization?
Probably it starts in my mind with who the champion's going to be and competing resources or maybe lack of resources, right? Because most people haven't gone out and looked for a functional position or an employee that's going to be their data governance officer. Now, if you're an enterprise company, you might. But the reality of it is if you haven't started this process, this is going to be a process that you need to think about as far as competing resources. Um, who who's going to be part of the team, who's going to lead it, how much time are you going to dedicate to it? Because this is one of those elements that if you start and you delay, you end up having to kind of go back to the beginning because you kind of start to forget about the traction that you made to get there, right? So it's competing resources. Some people will not like changes that come because there may be scenarios where we restrict access. There may be areas where we provide more access to data. And so some people might say, no, that data should be in my department. And no, organizationally, we need it to be broader. And the converse of that, well, everybody's had access to this, or a majority of people. And no, wait a minute, we need to control this better. Not that they're not going to be able to get the data, but we need to know that we're providing that or that they get access for a short period of time. I think the other thing we touched on already is people are going to look at this as, well, this is IT.
Right.
This is security. This is data. This is IT.
Uniquely IT.
This
specific. They're just going to throw it on their plate.
Yeah, and IT is going to run with this, fix this, deal with this, and be done with it. And although IT plays a huge component, we're not trying to minimize that. But this is an organizational culture change for data governance. I mentioned categorization, right?
Yeah.
Don't get stuck in that. Because you could really spend an awful lot of time in that and try to get real granular. I would say keep it simple to start with. And once you have it pulled together, you can add a category and now slide those data pieces across as compared to trying to build out 15 or 30 categories to start with.
My mind went from when you said culture shift, and then my mind immediately went to categorization because from to implement things, and one of the big things to implement would be being able to categorize the data. And I think back to doing certain things. Is this data sensitive, and being able to just go into Word and say click sensitive and click tag this, just doing those things as you're saving data for cloud storage. And this is a very specific example, but I think we can all agree that tagging some of those things is kind of a small step towards going in that general direction, right? And that is an easy thing for users to do that isn't overly intrusive. And even if we can get going down that road, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other challenges, and I don't want to miss this one, most companies, not all, right? Most companies probably have had data sprawl over the years, right? It's become easier and easier to store data, and we've got multiple copies of that data. So that's a challenge to start with, is data sprawl, and possibly the challenge of identifying where is the right source of truth. And if you have three sources of truth, having the organization come together and decide which one is the one we're going to call primary, and then what do we do with the other sources? Do we keep them? Do we remove them? And if we remove them, how does that impact people who are using them? And now you're starting to talk about data analytics and user groups and things like that. So data sprawl can be a challenge.
Yep, I know. I definitely hear that. It's a real thing, especially anywhere we run into, especially when you have multiple groups. And you and I have talked, and people already know about me that I do a lot of teams work. And whenever we go into an organization that already has done the Wild West teams, as I like to say, they have 3 sales teams and 4 marketing teams. There's data sprawl everywhere. They've got just data everywhere, and you have to deal with that single source of truth. And right there is a real world example of data governance that has to be dealt with.
And this isn't this isn't a mountain, right? This is a hill that we climb up, you get to the top, you can see the future, and then you keep it there. But there's diligence, right? You have to keep this front of mind for the organization. You bring in a new system. Whoa, we're going to have new data.
Yep.
So let's deal with that up front, or we're going to decommission a system. We might lose data. So again, that visualization of where the data is at, the type of data it is, the classifications of it, and then all of the data loss protection around it.
We've only got about 5 minutes left. I just want to kind of hit up to everybody and say, hey, please, please, please hit us up with any questions you might have. Todd is an excellent resource for this, has a lot of experience. 2 points I want to really hit on quick since we only have a few minutes left. We talked briefly about regulatory information. Can you give us a couple examples of regulatory type data governance where it's kind of really a must that you got to get your data under control?
Yeah, I can give you a couple. And so I'm going to relate to healthcare, right, where I spent a majority of my career, but really this can be across any vertical. So when healthcare came out with protected health information, right, with PHI data, well, people hear PHI data, but there's 18 very specific data elements that make PHI up. One of those is social security number. So when this information came forward, think about how many pieces of software or how many applications, instead of displaying the whole social security number, now only display the last 4 digits for most users, except for very restricted users can see the whole component of it. So it's just not necessarily knowing the data field and the category or the sensitivity, but understand how people are going to use it. So that's just one very specific example, David.
Excellent, excellent. And then the other topic I wanted you to touch on really is about data loss prevention. And I had mentioned a topic earlier about, like say HR, relating to HR, but also I think in the greater scheme of things, just overall data loss. When you have, there's kind of 2 results, somebody deletes a file that they shouldn't have, or even worse, they made revisions to some document 3 weeks ago, but now they need to get that information back. That kind of stuff. Well, where does that fall in this entire schema of things we're talking about?
It should be right at the top of the list of things to think about, right? So when you think about data loss protection, you've got to think about validating backups. Everybody says, "Oh, we got backups in place." Are you validating them?
Do you?
Are you recovering from them? Are you testing them, right? And then where's the backup going? And so the whole world of backups and recovery is part of data loss prevention, as well as different medias, right? I mean, you can walk out in a parking lot and you see a small USB stick laying there. The real question is it encrypted or is it free for anybody to view? So when you start about data loss prevention, you think about staff access, mobile device access. Is data able to be copied out of somewhere, or can you only use it from that location, right? So yeah, data loss prevention in itself is a whole topic to think about, but in specific to data governance, in order to protect your data, you have to be able to recover. So backup validation, backup testing, recovery testing, how long will it take to recover from an incident, right? Because you're going to have a business outage during that time. And then again, everything from are the backups encrypted, right? And are the backups air gapped? All the technical pieces about that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So where, just in the minute or 2 we have left, where do we go from here? If I'm a business owner and I'm like, oh man, I'm not doing this, where would one go from? I have nothing and I need to look at where would I start?
Well, start with trusted advisors, and hopefully that the people listening in today look at NCI as trusted advisors, right? And so you start there, and then if I'm a business owner, I look at my company and I go, okay, who's the right person, or where's the right group to champion this? And then get some education around it, right? Get some understanding about what it's going to take, who can lead it, who can I talk to learn more. And like anything, it starts with education, it starts with understanding, and then start a plan, build it out, try it, get executive buy-in. So that's kind of the 4 or 5 elements that I would suggest where to start for next steps.
Excellent. Nobody plans to fail, they just fail to plan. Am I right?
How true. Unfortunately, how true.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, Todd, we've really come to the end of our time, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very educational, and it's an awesome topic. For all of you joining us, if you have additional questions for Todd after the broadcast, feel free to visit our website at www.netcenter.net. Feel free to email us at info@netcenter.net, or visit us on any of our social media channels. And please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the little bell for notifications when we do go live. We do this broadcast every 2 weeks on Wednesday at 11 o'clock Central Standard Time. So please feel free to join us, and we'll have all kinds of different topics that are important in the IT and business world today. So, Todd, thanks again for all the information you've given us. Really do appreciate it. It's been a great time to talk to you. So thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks, David.
All right. And goodbye to everyone. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on
Thank you.